What's up, everybody? Welcome in to another edition of the Live for Supercross podcast. This week going in on round 16 from Denver. And of course, right up front, we have to address all the anarchy that resulted from Eli Tomac's injury. 1 second, he was running up front. He looks great all night. And within 10 minutes, we're hearing not only is he not coming back in this one, but he's out for the rest of the season. Ruptured his Achilles tendon. And not only does that have implications, huge implications for the rest of the season, it has implications for his career as well. And more than being dramatic, everything that took place in that short span of time was simply bizarre. I mean, he overjumps this thing by just a little bit. He's trying to land on the downside of this tabletop, doubling out of the corner, and he just extends his legs thinking he's going to land in the bottom of the transition, nice and prepared to absorb the shock and stay low over the next triple. And all of a sudden, he's pulling off just a little bit overzealous, and that ends up just overtaxing the body. And how often do you see a guy injure himself catastrophically when he doesn't even go down? So that adds to the bizarre nature of all this right here. And then you got to consider the fact that coming into this thing, we were expecting a pretty boring, a pretty mundane race to begin with. And not only because the championship was supposed to be all tied up in favor of Eli Tomac, especially after Cooper Webb went out for the rest of the season last week in Nashville, but because at this point we are down to bare bones when it comes to factory riders. There were only a handful of guys on factory rides lining up to begin the night, and even that would get whittled down with Eli and Colt as the night went on. So it was only Chase Sexton, Adam Sansarillo, and Kenny Roxon, sort of, who had factory rides, and they all ended up on the podium at the end of the night. And that's because you got to think about all the guys that are out. We talked about Cooper Webb. We know Justin Barcia went down in the same event in the main last week. Jason Anderson breaks his neck in practice. He'd been riding with a fractured C5 or C6, I think he said on Instagram, or something like that. And those were just the recent victims. We were already missing Dylan Ferrandis, already missing Christian Craig, recently lost Aaron Plessinger, and Malcolm Stewart only got a couple rounds in before he succumbed to an injury that required surgery and put him out for the rest of the season. So you pretty much expected at the beginning of the evening for Chase to come out, for Eli to let him blow right by, to tuck in behind him, and then to have Ken Roxon, the number 94 on the Suzuki, and Adam Sansarillo, the number 9 on the Cowie, battling for third place. And of course, that is what we end up getting pretty much, except for the devastating turn of events that took Eli out and absolutely ruined his championship. And of course, you already know that this all happened. You've probably heard it talked to death already. But the best we can do, given that, is to examine why this happened. Now, maybe that sounds stupid on the surface, to examine why a guy overjumped something. Of course, you know, he's leading. He's trying to build a gap, and things happen in a split second out there. But I think the argument can be made that Eli Tomac doesn't typically make these kinds of mistakes. And I think the reason that he did is because he was so fired up. And it's easy to see why. Not only is he on the verge of his third championship, but he's in his home state, and no crowd has ever cheered louder, or at least this season hasn't even approached the decibel level that they reached when they were giving it up for Eli Tomac on Saturday. He gets up front early in that first heat event, and the crowd goes nuts when he's going down the stadium length rhythm section. He takes that right 90 into the shorter rhythm section down the end zone baseline, and the people are just deafening. You can't hear any of the announcers on the broadcast. And Eli gets the same reaction again when he grabs the lead early with a great start and gets around McElrath in the main event. These people love him. They know they might not get a chance to see him race indoors again. And Eli's a guy that loves his fans. I think that's pretty well documented. And he's not just the type of guy to mail in a ride just to protect the championship in these circumstances. I think if the race has taken place in Salt Lake City, he probably does, even if it wasn't the last round of the series. I think those people being there and amping him up made a difference. And I think we saw the results of that turn and just happened to be absolutely unfortunate. That being said, it's not as if Eli did anything wrong, but because of the results as they turned out, it was something we have to talk about. And the bizarre nature of all that happened with Eli definitely extended to the guy that ends up winning the championship now, even if he doesn't line up, which is Chase Sexton. We know he came into this thing 18 points down, and he's just trying to keep it alive. That's his main objective. And you can see a moment, even after he finishes the race, he passed Eli as Eli was rolling around with his leg up, but he didn't have time to stop and look at him, so he doesn't know what's wrong with the guy. He later said either on the podium or in the press conference that he thought Eli probably had bike problems or something. So he went from thinking he didn't really have a chance, living on a prayer, to thinking he's up, 8 points now going into the last race of the season. And he wasn't celebrating at all after that win when he was sitting around with the rest of the crew. He was just focused on next week. He knew he now had a chance, and that was where his mind was completely. And even after he did find out what happened and all was said and done, and even as it dawned on the broadcasters towards the main event, as they started to do the points calculations to see how far behind Ken Roxon was, there was never a chance where Chase Sexton really got to celebrate, where it really felt like a championship victory. And it makes you really curious going into next week if there is going to be a proper celebration on the podium, or if this thing's going to be permanently dimmed, both by the fact that one of our favorite riders went down, and also by the fact that although the turn of events was super dramatic, it in the end, all of that drama ended up giving us an awfully anticlimactic conclusion, with the fact, of course, that the number 23 doesn't even have to line up next week, and with the fact that another guy that was ahead of him in the points succumbed to catastrophic injury just 1 week ago. You come off feeling like you don't want to celebrate without feeling guilty, and some people might come off feeling as if Chase Sexton didn't earn this completely. They might look at his season and look at all the times he washed the front end and put the bike down throughout the first part of the season. He's been very open about talking about it. And with all that stuff, even though he did recover late and do a great job in these last few weeks to fix the errors and still maintain the pace, he's looked absolutely excellent as of late. You could still look at it and say that maybe this wasn't a season that deserved a championship victory. Eli won 7 times this season. Not so for Chase Sexton. I think he comes up with 4 now. It might have been his 5th over the weekend. But either way, I do think, the guy earns it. He did not give up. There was a point when he was just recently down 18 points, and even going into Nashville, where he could have given up completely, and he chose not to do that. He ironed out the kinks at the last minute, and it's great to see this guy get a championship, I think. I think it was inevitable that he'd get one at some point in his career. Didn't think it would happen this quickly. I'm sure that nobody did. But in the end, what you end up getting is a situation where I think it will always have a small caveat there, unfortunately, even though I don't agree with it. And I think to counterbalance that, and even he'd probably think that to really solidify it, he's got to go out in the summer and nail down the Lucas Oil Motocross Championship. And I certainly think he's capable of doing it. That is, if Jet Lawrence isn't winning right from the beginning. And I think that would just do good to reinforce that he is worthy of any number of championships. And I'm sure there will be many that he ultimately ends up getting. Getting past the big headline drama and actually talking about the races themselves, we see one farther reason why this was such a disaster besides the obvious reasons. And that is, of course, if you remember on the show last week, I bitched about the fact that despite the fact that the points race has been close for the entire second half of the season, we've never got to see any of the top guys, any of the guys that are in points contention, really battle it out on an even playing field when they're both feeling it for any extended period of time during a main event or in a heat, really. And what we ended up getting in this heat and what we would have gotten in the main if Eli had managed to stay healthy was just that. Unlike last week in Nashville when Chase gets around Eli and he's not feeling confident, so he just lets Sexton take off. This week in the heat race, he tucks in right behind him and refuses to let the 23 pull away. And it was just beautiful to see on the broadcast them blitzing the whoops one after another. The guy on the blue bike tucked behind the guy on the HRC Honda. And it gave me flashbacks and goosebumps in a good way to those nearly unmatchable moments that we did get in the outdoor season. Would have loved to see some of that in the main. And now it turns out we might not ever get to see it again, which is another thing, I guess, that adds to the tragedy. But despite the tragedy, for some other guys, it turned out pretty well. There were a couple guys besides Chase Sexton in this thing, in the 450 division, that really needed wins. Of course, we're talking about the number 9 of Adam Sansarillo and the number 94 of Ken Roxon. They swap positions in the heat race going 1-2, and they end up going 2-3 in the main event here. Adam Sansarillo brought to tears. This is the first podium he's got this year and a whole lot longer than that. He was open about the fact, both on the podium and in the press conference, he didn't think he'd ever get there again. Guy thought about quitting riding at one point, and to see him get back on there, thin field or not, I think is just exactly the break he needs to come into this outdoor season in a couple weeks and show us flashes of the old Sansarillo, who just has the potential to dominate the field in the outdoor season. Also great for Kenny. This guy's gotten on the podium, taken 3/3 in the last 3 weeks, and now he gets a second place to add to the collection. And this win by him was just absolutely impressive for multiple reasons. One, you got to consider the guy has had health problems in the past, and you could see that even these guys, as fit as they are, a lot of them were struggling at elevation, even after the heat races in the 250s, pretty short. Some guys just huffing down air. Levi Kitchen was struggling a little bit, and a lot of guys were. And to see him not only put in the full 20, but to see that he fell on the first turn, gets tied up with Shane McElrath on the hole shot, goes down, and he climbed back from last place to second, and on that track, with the limited horsepower, even harder to throw the bike around. So this guy just must be a cardiovascular specimen right now, that he was able to climb through the pack and get past Adam Sansarillo. So kudos to both of those guys for making lemonade out of the lemons that everyone else got on Saturday evening. Now, to transition into the small bikes here, obviously the big storyline here is that the 450 championship, not the only one that got decided in the 250 West class. We were expecting this thing to be tied up. Jet Lawrence just had to take 10th place, no matter how RJ did. And we know he's capable of that, or perhaps incapable of not doing that well unless the bike craps out on him. And there was a moment here, both in the heat race and in the main event, where it looked like getting that 10th was not going to be the easiest prospect for him. Pretty much right out of the gate, they come around the whole shot turn, hit that on-off. He gets tied up with another rider. It seemed like he was the one that switched lines, and he loses some time there, has to do some work to end up climbing back to 4th place overall. Still got him a decent gate pick, but definitely a certain amount of drama added there. Certainly not the smooth ride that his team probably intended for him. And despite the decent gate in the main, does not get a great start and ends up having to climb through the pack again, ends up getting on the podium, which is, of course, good enough to get him his championship. It is his 4th championship overall, and probably not the ride he expected to put in that would be his last championship celebration of a 250 event. Of course, I'm sure he's not that heartbroken because he fully expects and probably will have many more championships on the big bikes eventually to add to his collection. But I think his main event ride is worth taking a look at just for a second for a pretty interesting reason besides the fact that it gets him the trophy. And that is something that actually his brother Hunter pointed out when he was a guest on the broadcast. You notice that after Jet went down, he didn't make his way through the pack as quickly as he is capable of. And there's one point where he gets tucked behind Derek Kelly, who's putting in absolute excellent lap times at this point. And Jet Lawrence on this track with few passing options does not have an opportunity to get around him easily. And he stops advancing through the pack here, a very long distance from the front, and just rides on Kelly's tail for a while with about 12 minutes left to go, which I thought was pretty uncharacteristic of Jet Lawrence. But his brother Hunter said that his strategy would just be to settle in and play it out and really not push it until he got to the 10-minute mark. And he said as soon as he got to the 10-minute mark, that's when he was really going to twist the throttle open. And that's exactly what happened. 2 minutes later, Jet was absolutely tearing through the pack again, got around Kelly, got around Mumford, and just started advancing and making that charge to 3rd place. But the reason I think this is so utterly fascinating is it shows that these guys aren't just out there trying to run fast. They're putting in lap times that are besting everybody else in both of their respective divisions. And yet they're at all times adhering to a strategy. They have a contingency for if things go well. They have a contingency for if things don't. And all of those contingencies are based around risk management as the first priority. And while that might not always make for the most interesting race, it does absolutely contribute to all the trophies that family has already begun to collect and seems intent on continuing to collect. And I just thought that insight was really valuable. It shows just another thing in their toolkit that makes the Lawrence brothers so dangerous. Just like Kenny Roczen and Adam Sansarillo took advantage of the champ's absence in the 450 class, so too in the 250s, there were a few guys that took advantage of the fact that Jet was not having one of his typical evenings. Actually, his worst finish of the entire season hadn't taken worse than a second to this point. But those guys are Enzo Lopes, Levi Kitchen, and RJ Hampshire. We'll start about talking about the Brazilian first. Enzo Lopes, the number 56, ends up getting his best finish of the year in a heat race. He had not won a heat race in his career. to this point, finally gets it done, and he was stoked on it. And it was not something that just fell into his lap. He absolutely had to work for it. Mitchell Oldenburg didn't make it easy to make the pass. Enzo Lopes nearly kills himself on that wall jump trying to get by him. And then Carson Mumford gets by Enzo Lopes, lines him up over the rhythm section, first rhythm section of the track, cuts underneath him in the 180 bull berm. And it would have been easy for Enzo to settle in and just pass on his dreams of getting a heat race win, but he doesn't, even though Mumford has the pace here and looked as good as he had all season. Enzo Lopes showed patience, waited on him till about the 30-second mark, ends up blitzing inside on the whoops, takes the line away from Mumford, super clean pass, and just to make sure he maintains the lead, he hits this giant wall jump, doubling it again instead of just rolling it, and he almost comes up short again, and it was just a ballsy move for him to be trying it. This was a point on the track that determined a lot of time, whether you could hit it or not. Pretty much everybody in the 450s could, but with the lack of horsepower, a lot of the 250 guys were struggling, and of all the jumps on the track you don't want to come up short on, you do not want to case this one. You're falling out of the sky as it is. The fact that Enzo was throwing caution to the wind shows how much he wanted it. And he ends up doing great in the main event as well. Ends up finishing quite a few seconds behind Jet, but taking fourth overall, just missing out on the podium. And it really makes you wonder. I predicted at the beginning of the season after the first couple rounds that this guy would get at least a third place in a main event by the end of the season. I thought he was podium bound. And with just 1 week left, he's tied his best finish, but has not come out and broken over that wall. And so I hope he does it last week, and I'm going to put it out there, the good energy that he does. And it's going to take more aggressive moves like the one he made on Max Voland, I would imagine. Feel bad for Max. He was running well in the evening to that point. But with these hard-packed tracks and the lack of traction, sometimes you have to do things like that if you do want to be on top. You know, sometimes it takes being aggressive. Enzo hasn't always shown a willingness to do that. And I don't think this newfound willingness and his newfound first heat win ever coinciding are a mere coincidence. But even more so than Enzo Lopes, there were two other guys in the 250 class that just absolutely gave us a show on Saturday night. RJ Hampshire, one of them, and he's given us some good battles throughout the season, either with Jet or with Levi in Glendale, with Jet and some other places as well, or with Cameron McAdoo, when they battled it out in Seattle when McAdoo was still healthy. But tonight it was all about the chef and the number 24. They were just going at it. And while you might think in the main event, the fact that RJ Hampshire was able to track Kitchedow twice, even after he stalls or shifts into neutral and cases that double really badly, you might think the fact he chases Kitchedow shows that he was just running all that much faster than the guy on the Star Racing Yamaha. But I think if you look at the night as a whole, it's a little bit more complicated than that. If you look at the heat race, Levi Kitchen gets out just ahead of RJ right off the start, and RJ's never able to catch him. He was not settling in. He was not that type of guy. And although he was within a second for most of the race, he never gets close enough to make the pass. Their speed there was pretty much as even as it could be, with either one still having an edge. The edge, of course, going to the winner of that, Levi Kitchen. And if you look at the main event, well, it's not as if RJ gets one of the mediocre starts that he kind of suffers sometimes. He was not far off Kitchen again. And it takes him the majority of the race to track him down. 10 minutes have already ticked off the clock by the time that he reels Kitchen in, by the time that Levi makes that stumble in that short end zone rhythm section, doesn't make it clean onto the first on-off, and gives RJ the chance for the pass. Of course, in this moment on first inspection, it looks like Levi runs him wide. Not at all the case. He just held his line which was absolutely excellent racecraft by then. We only found out that RJ shifted into neutral after the fact, but that happened late, and it's really only after this happens that the difference in pace between RJ and Levi are significant. Levi was not trying to take off and run this thing home. He later admitted on the podium that he was looking over his shoulder too much, and he was wondering if RJ was coming. He's not used to leading races, and he just slowed down a bit. If he continued to run the paces that he was earlier in the evening, either in the heat or at the beginning of the main event, I don't think RJ closes that 5-second gap, despite the fact that RJ put in insane laps to do it. You cannot take anything away from the number 24, but I think the fact that he had the time to reel him back in when it took him so long to get there in the first place was the fact that Levi Kitchen is a little experienced, as he said himself. And if you look at it, it's just crazy to think that this guy doesn't have a win on the season. This would have been his first one, and he won a Triple Crown. He won Anaheim too, so I figured he'd won one, but he didn't. I remember back, and he was on the podium every event, did not get the win. Then you go to Glendale, where he looked the best he has all season, aside from the first Triple Crown win. This a Triple Crown too, and again, he never gets the first position. This was going to be his first ever win, and with RJ casing that thing, it was a pretty extraordinary circumstance. And I think if this guy finds himself in this position again, he just puts the throttle down and gets it done. And I think the evidence of that is that even after RJ passed him, he then tucked in behind him and found the same speed that RJ had put in to track down Levi Kitchen. And I think if the race had gone on for a few laps longer, RJ would not have been able to build any kind of a gap at all. So be interesting to see if Levi can finally get a main event win in Salt Lake in the final round of the season. When that happens, we'll get back on here and talk about everything that went down. And I hate to make this prediction and be found out wrong, but I don't think it's going to be nearly as dramatic next week as it was here in Denver, in the Mile High City, and I think that's a good thing. I said after Nashville that there couldn't be a race any more dramatic than what happened to Cooper Webb, and I was proved wrong then, so we'll see if I get proved wrong again. At the very least, it will be interesting to see the newly crowned Lawrence brothers go at it, although I'm sure the NBC crew is bound to overhype it a little bit, and it will be interesting to see what kind of celebration Chase Sexton ends up getting. In the meantime, I hope you all find your flow this week, and I want you to do your best to try to remember that if you live for Supercross, then you need some love from the Live for Supercross podcast.